It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? How dramatically the world map can shift in, well, just a century.
It's quite something.
We're talking about the British Empire, specifically in Africa and Asia. It reaches this incredible peak, and then almost just as quickly, it contracts.
Yeah, that period, mid-19th to mid-20th century,
Yeah.
it's a remarkably swift rise and fall in that grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. And that roughly 100-year span, say the 1850s to the late 1960s, that's exactly what we're digging into today with the materials we've got.
A century just packed with massive global changes.
Exactly. So, our goal for you in this deep dives is to really get underneath what drove this incredible story. We want to move past the simple narratives because honestly, the sources show it's way more complex.
A real interplay of different factors.
Right. We want to give you a clear sense of the main phases involved.
And those phases, looking at the sources, they kind of broke down into three main chunks. First, there's that big push for expansion, particularly in Africa, roughly 1857 up to, say, World War I in 1914. Then you've got the period of the world wars themselves, 1914 to 45. And that's interesting because it includes both gaining new territories, but also the first real signs of the empire shrinking.
A bit of paradox there.
hmm And finally, that pretty rapid and often messy period of decolonization, roughly 1947 through to 1967.
Got it. And throughout all this, we'll be looking at, well, the economic drivers, the political games, the social ideas floating around back then, obviously the huge impact of the wars, and critically, the rise of nationalist movements.
All those threads weaving together.
Okay, let's jump into that first phase then. Expansion in the mid-19th century. Where did it all start? What were the initial sparks?
Well, a really key starting point, the material highlights this, is Britain having to rethink things after losing the American colonies.
Ah, right.
There was a definite shift in focus, sometimes called the swing to the east, basically looking for new places to find wealth and keep Britain's influence up.
Okay, so it wasn't just about pride then. Real economic reasons, especially in Africa, stuff becoming more valuable.
Oh, definitely. The pull of African resources was strong. Gold, ivory, diamonds. They're all mentioned specifically.
Right.
And also, think about cotton. The American Civil War really messed up the supply for Britain's textile factories. So places like Egypt became, well, really important alternative sources.
And speaking of Egypt, the Suez Canal keeps popping up. Seems like a massive strategic piece.
Absolutely critical. That canal, for trade routes, especially the route to India, you just can't overstate its importance.
So when the Khedive, Ismail Pasha, got into money trouble.
Exactly. He was trying to modernize, spent a lot. So when Disraeli snapped up a big chunk of Suez Canal shares for Britain in 1875, that was huge.
A real turning point.
Yeah, it signaled much deeper British involvement, financially first, then politically.
It's amazing how buying shares could lead to so much control. And that control, it wasn't always official, was it? This idea of a veiled protectorate in Egypt.
That term, veiled protectorate, it really nails it. Technically, Egypt was still part of the Ottoman Empire, but the reality, Britain was pulling the strings. They put Tewfik Pasha in charge,
Right.
basically puppet ruler, with the British Consul General Evelyn Baring watching over him very closely.
So informal control, but very real.
Very real. And the Convention of London in 1885 just kind of cemented that.
Okay, so economics, strategy, clear drivers. But the sources also mention culture, ideology, this muscular Christianity thing. What was that about?
Right. Muscular Christianity. It was a big idea in Victorian Britain, kind of combined physical strength, Christian duty, and frankly, a strong belief that British culture was superior.
Okay.
A lot of the guys running things in government, the army, they'd gone to schools where this was drilled in. It gave them a sort of justification in their view for going out and civilizing other places.
So it wasn't just an idea, it actually affected how they acted.
Oh yeah, it fed into that paternalistic attitude of colonial officials. Justified intervening, sometimes pretty brutally, in the name of progress or civilization. It really shaped how they dealt with local people and systems.
And that mindset seems to connect with the explorers and missionaries, too. They weren't just drawing maps or looking for converts.
Exactly. People like Livingstone finding Victoria Falls or Burton and Speke. Their stories, they were huge back home, shaped how people pictured Africa.
Created a certain image.
Definitely. And missionaries, even with good intentions, often saw local religions and cultures as, well, primitive, which just reinforced that idea of European superiority.
Now, all this expansion obviously led to some tricky situations. Sudan seems like a prime example, mainly because it's right next to Egypt and that vital Suez Canal.
Yeah, Sudan got pulled in almost directly because of Britain's involvement in Egypt. They put Colonel Charles Gordon in as Governor General under the Khedive, who was already leaning heavily on Britain.
Right, Gordon of Khartoum.
That's him. His job was partly to stop the slave trade, but that, plus attempts to bring in Western ways, really stirred up resentment among Sudanese Muslims.
Which then leads to the Mahdi and that famous siege.
Precisely. Muhammad Ahmed declared himself the Mahdi, called for a jihad against the foreigners. The Egyptians were busy with their own revolt, so the Mahdists gained ground fast.
And the British got drawn in deeper.
Well, after an Anglo-Egyptian force was defeated, Gladstone, the prime minister back then, actually ordered a withdrawal. That set the scene for Gordon making his stand in Khartoum in 1885.
And his death was a huge shock back in Britain.
Massive blow to prestige, yeah. Really hit the public hard. But it's interesting, Gladstone had been reluctant to get too involved initially. And even while all this drama was happening in Khartoum, Britain was still busy securing its economic interests elsewhere, like around the Niger Delta.
Okay, so that covers that initial burst of expansion. But moving towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th, the approach changed a bit. More about consolidating maybe, and the government getting more directly involved instead of companies.
That's a really key shift, yeah. Between about 1890 and 1914, you see less reliance on those chartered companies like the Imperial British East Africa Company or the Royal Niger Company,
Right.
and more direct British rule. Establishing protectorates, crown colonies, things become more formal.
And East Africa seems to become a real hotspot then. Zanzibar, Uganda, Kenya. The map gets a lot more red there.
Definitely. And you see the European powers carving things up.
Yeah.
Deal with Germany in 1890 is a classic example.
Mm.
Britain basically gets Kenya and Uganda. Germany gets Tanganyika.
A trade-off.
Exactly. And then building the Uganda Railway, the Lunatic Express, as they called it.
Why lunatic?
Because it was hugely expensive, difficult terrain, faced resistance. Famously, the man-eating lions of Savo incident happened during its construction.
Yeah.
But the point was economic.
Right, connecting the interior, getting resources out.
Especially cotton, yeah, linking it to the coast, the Indian Ocean. But that resistance from groups like the Nandi and the Savo Lions, it shows the human cost and the challenges.
And Kenya itself seems important. Protectorate, then colony, even early protests like Harry Thuku's.
Yeah, Kenya was vital as the route to Uganda. Suppressing any German influence there was key, too. Protectorate in 95, then a full colony by 1920. That shows the tightening grip. And Thuku's protests, though put down, were definitely early signs of resistance bubbling up.
West Africa, too, saw this move to direct rule. Nigeria, the Gold Coast. The Royal Niger Company was big there first, but then the government took over.
Yeah, it's that pattern again. Private company starts things off, establishes a presence, exploits resources like palm oil. George Goldie and the Royal Niger Company were key there.
But problems arose.
Yes. Clashes with German companies, but also how they treated local rulers. King Koko, the Oba of Benin, are mentioned. This put pressure on London to take direct control.
So the government stepped in.
In 1900, yeah. Created northern and southern Nigeria protectorates, then unified them in 1914, mostly for economic efficiency. And in Ashanti-land, modern Ghana, after several wars, Britain just annexed it when the king wouldn't submit. Became part of the Gold Coast colony. Forceful assertion of power.
And Sudan. After pulling out after Gordon, Britain goes back in under Salisbury. Why the change of heart?
A few things came together there. One was definitely competition worries about the French moving into the Nile region, making deals with Abyssinia.
The scramble for Africa heating up?
Absolutely. But also British pride. Restoring national honor after Gordon's death was a big motivator. So Kitchener leads the reconquest in 1898.
Battle of Omdurman.
That's the one. Very decisive, technologically driven victory. They built the Sudan Military Railway to help. Then there was that standoff with the French at Fashoda shortly after, which really highlighted the rivalry.
So Britain secured control?
Anglo-Egyptian control, officially. But interestingly, they set up Gordon Memorial College, which ended up educating future Sudanese leaders. Kind of planted the seeds for later self-determination, ironically.
And finally, South Africa. Diamonds. Gold. That really changed the game there, didn't it? Led to some brutal stuff.
Oh, completely. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley, then gold on the Rand. It transformed the place. Massively increased British interest and competition for control.
Cecil Rhodes territory.
Exactly. His British South Africa Company pushed north into what became Rhodesia and Nyasaland. But down south, in the Cape, things were getting tense. German gangs nearby, the Boers feeling more confident, and this issue of the Uitlanders, the foreign workers, mostly British, and the Boer Transvaal Republic, who didn't have rights.
Under Kruger, right, which led to the Jameson raid.
That's it. A totally botched attempt by Rhodes's associates to trigger an uprising in the Transvaal failed miserably.
And the consequences.
Huge embarrassment for Britain, actually strengthened Boer resistance. The German Kaiser even sent Kruger a congratulatory telegram, which didn't help Anglo-German relations. It basically made the Anglo-Boer War almost inevitable.
Which happened just a few years later.
1899 to 1902. Britain won eventually. It was a long, costly war, and the use of concentration camps caused a huge outcry.
A dark chapter.
Definitely. And crucially, the peace deal denied voting rights to non-whites. That concession to the Boers basically laid the groundwork for apartheid later on. Shows how imperial actions had these really deep, long-lasting social consequences.
And the sources mention this peripheral theory of imperialism. What's the gist of that? Formal control only when informal wasn't working.
Yeah, basically. The idea is that Britain often preferred not to rule directly if they could help it.
Cheaper, less hassle.
Probably.
Yeah.
They preferred influencing things through trade, using those chartered companies, economic leverage. Formal control, actually setting up a colonial administration, was more like a plan B.
So they'd only do it
If that informal control was threatened, maybe by local instability, or crucially, by another European power moving in. So taking formal control was peripheral to their main strategy of economic influence. Helps explain that shift we saw from company rule to direct rule.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered that big expansion phase. Now, the World Wars, 1914 to 1945, you said this was a period of both expansion and contraction starting. How did that work?
Well, take World War I. Afterwards, Britain actually gained territory. Germany and the Ottoman Empire lost their colonies, and Britain got control of some of them as League of Nations mandates.
So the empire got bigger, on paper at least.
Geographically, yes. Its largest extent ever, actually.
Yeah.
But the war itself started changing things internally.
How so? The Dominions, India, Africa, they all pitched in, right?
Hugely. The White Dominions, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, sent troops, resources. Think ANZTs at Gallipoli, Canadian troops on the Western Front, food exports.
But that support came with strings attached? Or expectations?
Exactly. It really boosted their sense of national identity, their feeling that they deserved more autonomy. You started seeing pushback, too, like arguments over conscription in Australia, protests in Quebec.
And what about India and Africa? Their contribution often gets overlooked.
Massively overlooked. Over 1 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain all over the world. India paid more financially, too. This definitely fueled demands for more self-government back home.
Leading to reforms.
Yes. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms came out of this, promising more Indian involvement in government, this diarchy system. It was a step, anyway. Same in Egypt. They provided troops, suffered casualties. There were promises of more Egyptian control after the war, even though Britain declared it a protectorate. Hints of change.
Let's talk about those League of Nations mandates. That sounds different from just grabbing colonies.
It was, in theory. The idea was that these ex-German, ex-Ottoman territories weren't just spoils of war. The Allied powers were meant to administer them as mandates on behalf of the League.
With the goal of?
Eventual independence. That was the principle. They had different grades, A, B, C, based on how ready they were, supposedly. A, mandates like Palestine and Iraq were seen as closer to self-rule.
But Palestine, that didn't exactly go smoothly.
No. Palestine became incredibly complicated, tragic, really. Britain needed it strategically, near the Suez Canal. But during the war, they had made conflicting promises.
To Arab leaders and also the Balfour Declaration.
Exactly. Promises of Arab independence in the Hussein McMahon letters. Then the secret Sykes-Picot deal with France, carving up the Middle East. And the Balfour Declaration supporting a Jewish homeland.
A recipe for disaster.
Pretty much. It created this tangle of competing claims, deep resentment, laid the groundwork for decades of conflict we still see today.
Ireland also went through huge changes around this time. Home rule was on the table, then the war, then the Easter Rising.
Home rule got postponed because of the war, which angered nationalists. The 1916 Easter Rising, though crushed, really radicalized the movement.
Led to guerrilla war.
Yes, and eventually the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921 created the Irish Free State, but as a dominion, still linked to Britain, and crucially it partitioned the island, keeping Northern Ireland in the UK.
Which remained contentious.
Deeply. Ireland eventually became fully independent as heir in 1937, but the division remained.
Okay, then World War II hits, another global conflict. How did that impact the empire?
World War II was even more transformative, I'd say. The fighting directly hit British colonies in Asia.
The fall of Singapore.
Huge shock. Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, all lost to Japan in 1942. It shattered the image of British invincibility.
And Japan even tried to invade India.
They did in 1944. Plus, you had figures like Subhas Chandra Bose forming the Indian National Army to fight alongside the Japanese against the British.
Wow. And in Burma.
Aung San initially worked with the Japanese too, hoping for independence before switching sides later. Shows how complex the situation was for colonial nationalists.
And the economic cost of WWII for Britain must have been astronomical.
Absolutely crippling. They had to sell off overseas investments, ran up massive debts, especially to the U.S. under Lend-Lease.
Making it harder to afford running an empire.
Much harder. After the war, Britain was broke. There was a dollar shortage. Trade focus started shifting towards Europe. They even had to devalue the pound in 1949. The economic case for empire was seriously weakening. It's ironic, isn't it? Economic drivers fueled the expansion, but the costs, especially of the wars, helped fuel the contraction.
And back home in Britain, attitudes were changing too. Labor government, welfare state.
Definitely. The Labour government elected in 45 was focused on building the welfare state, the NHS, Social Security, based on the Beveridge Report.
Priorities shifted inward.
Yeah, after the sacrifices of the war, people wanted better lives at home. Plus, you had stronger nationalist movements demanding independence, and maybe a growing sense, especially after fighting fascism, that ruling over other people wasn't quite right anymore. The will to hold on to the empire was fading. Technology also made self-governance seem more possible for many colonies.
India and the Middle East were still hot spots during the interwar years and the war itself, right? Setting the stage for what came next.
Crucially, in India, that 1919 Act introduced diarchy, sharing some power. But then you had things like the Rowlatt Act, allowing detention without trial, and the awful Amritsar massacre in 1919.
That must have damaged Britain's image badly.
Immensely. Lost a lot of moral authority. Later, you had the Round Table Conferences, the 1935 Government of India Act giving more autonomy. But things really came to a head in WWII.
How so?
The Viceroy declared war on India's behalf without asking Indian politicians. Congress leaders resigned in protest. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement in 1942. He and Nehru were jailed. The demand for full independence was unstoppable by the war's end.
In Palestine, the situation there got even worse.
Much worse. The Holocaust led to a huge surge in Jewish refugees trying to get to Palestine. Relations between Arabs and Jews deteriorated rapidly.
And Britain was caught in the middle.
Completely. They tried to limit Jewish immigration, but faced massive pressure, especially from the U.S. under Truman, who supported it. It became untenable. In 1947, Britain basically washed its hands of it and handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations.
Which led to the partition plan.
Yes, and the subsequent conflict.
Okay, so that brings us to the final phase in the sources.
Yeah.
Decolonization, roughly 1947 to 1967. Now, there's always this debate. Did Britain give up the empire willingly, manage the decline, or was it forced out? What's the take here?
Well, the sources suggest it wasn't really one simple thing. It was a mix of pressures that just made holding on impossible, or at least undesirable.
Like what?
The economic cost, as we said, was huge after WWII. Britain couldn't afford it. They were also increasingly reliant on the U.S., which was generally anti-colonial, especially in the Cold War context.
And the nationalist movements.
Absolutely critical. They were stronger, better organized, often with very charismatic leaders. They couldn't be ignored anymore. Plus, Britain's focus was shifting towards Europe. The EEC was emerging. Maybe even global capitalism itself was changing, making formal colonies less necessary.
So Macmillan talking about a planned decline might be putting a gloss on it.
Possibly. Some historians argue it was more about finding new ways to maintain influence, economic imperialism, perhaps rather than formal rule. The Suez Crisis in '56 really hammered home Britain's reduced power on the world stage. That's often seen as a turning point.
We certainly see independence coming thick and fast in Africa during this period, East and West Africa.
Yeah, it seems quite rapid in places. Ghana, led by Nkrumah, was a major early example in West Africa, independent in '57. Nigeria followed in '60, though grappling with those internal ethnic divisions.
And East Africa.
Tanganyika became independent in '61, later joining Zanzibar to form Tanzania. Kenya's path was bloodier, with the Mau Mau Rebellion.
Which the British suppressed quite brutally.
They did. But suppressing it also cost Britain legitimacy. It probably sped up independence, which came in '63.
Central and Southern Africa seem more complicated, mainly because of apartheid in South Africa.
Definitely. South Africa's National Party coming to power in '48 and building the apartheid system made everything harder in the region.
How did that affect neighboring territories?
Well, places like Basutoland,
Yeah.
Lesotho, and Bechuanaland,
Hmm.
Botswana,
Right.
did get independence in '66,
Yeah.
partly as protectorates Britain didn't want South Africa getting hold of. But the attempt to create a Central African Federation linking the Rhodesias and Nyasaland failed. Strong African nationalist opposition. It broke up in '64, leading to independent Zambia and Malawi. But Southern Rhodesia, under white minority rule, declared independence unilaterally as Rhodesia.
Leading to a long civil war.
Yes, until the late 1970s,
Oh.
eventually leading to Zimbabwe under
Yeah.
Mugabe, a much more protracted and violent process there.
In Asia, decolonization seemed even quicker there after WWII, but maybe just as troubled.
Often, yes. The war really kicked things into high gear. Burma got independence in '48, but sadly fell straight into civil war that's arguably still echoing today.
Malaya.
Malaya had the communist insurgency, the Malayan Emergency, for over a decade. They formed the Federation of Malaya in '48, got independence in '57, then became Malaysia in '63 when Singapore joined.
But Singapore didn't stay part of Malaysia?
No, it was expelled in '65,
Mhm.
largely due to ethnic and political tensions. Then Lee Kuan Yew took Singapore on its own, unique, highly successful, though quite authoritarian path.
So, wrapping this deep dive up,
Hmm.
it's crystal clear the century wasn't a simple story, not just Britain ruling the waves then suddenly losing it all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was this incredibly complex mix. Economic drivers, strategic rivalries, the massive disruption of the world wars, the power of nationalism, changing ideas within Britain itself, all tangled together.
And so many fascinating, sometimes grim details. We touched on the Lunatic Express, the mandate system's contradictions, the human cost of it all. It really highlights how messy and multifaceted history is.
Absolutely. And it's vital to remember that people in the colonies weren't just passive subjects. They were active agents, resisting, adapting, demanding change, shaping their own futures.
Definitely. So here's a final thought, something for you listening to chew on, thinking about all these different forces we've discussed.
Economics, politics, war, ideology, nationalism.
Yeah, all of it. If you had to pick one factor, which do you think was ultimately the most influential in driving both that incredible expansion and the rapid contraction of the British Empire in this crucial century?
That's a tough one.
It is. There's no single easy answer. Historians still debate it. But it really makes you think about the legacies of that era and how they connect to the world we're living in right now. Something to definitely reflect on.